Now, today I'll be talking about Eric Hatton and his book, Taking Up the Challenge. Margaret and I met Eric on more than one occasion, and at least one of those was at the Barbanel Centre in Stafford when Margaret was undertaking teacher training up there, I believe, for the union. Or it might possibly have been on the occasion of a peace walk where the union decamps over to the Barbanel Centre from Arlewas, which is near Tamworth, across the top of the Midlands there, not very far, 20 miles maybe, over to the Barbanel Centre in Stafford, where the services then take place after the peace walk. So on this occasion, Eric was there with Sue Farrow, who was a former editor of Psychic News. And Eric has signed the book saying, "To Margaret and Paul, with my very best wishes, may something of what I have written give you inspiration. Eric." Very nice. And the book is an inspiration from beginning to end. So the book was published by Saturday Night Press Publications, our friend Anne Harrison. And the book is a who's who of spiritualists from the 1940s through to 2010. Because Eric met them. He met everyone who was anyone in spiritualism. And the book describes how he became a spiritualist, the evidence that the family were getting, especially his sister and possibly his mother, taking him along to spiritualist churches in the early part of the Second World War. And his later then meeting his wife, and both her history in spiritualism and also their combined investigations of spiritualism taking place together. And they met everyone, as I said. They met Gordon Higginson, Harry Edwards, Ernest Houghton, Tom Harrison, Alec Harris, lots of other mediums who really haven't hit the fame that maybe the quality of their mediumship should have given them. But, Eric Hatton had personal experience of healing in the early days with Harry Edwards. He met Maurice Barbanel. Lots and lots of people in the Spiritualist National Union. But he also sang at the convention for the Greater World Spiritualist Organization, with the Christian side of spiritualism. We had the privilege of visiting some of their churches in Oxford. Margaret worked at the headquarters church for the one-time president of the Greater World. So let's delve into the book then. It's about 250 pages long, filled with photographs, and as I said, a great many personal memories. So at one point in 1947, Eric describes how he was very ill. He was in the RAF at that time, and he describes how he got into the RAF. In the West Midlands during the Second World War, there was a lot of bombing taking place, and he was ill, and at some point, and which meant that he couldn't get through to be in a grammar school. So he left schooling at 14 and worked in a factory in a very dangerous foundry type situation. And he also at that point was volunteering as an air warden. So he had a lot of near misses as an air warden, bombs landing nearby, and airplanes. A British airplane crashed very close to where he stood at one point. But at that time also, he joined the Air Training Corps, which I did myself when I was young. And that led him into joining the RAF. And I think he was predominantly in the RAF after Second World War. But in 1947, he again found himself ill, and I think this time It was his back. Totally bedridden. Yeah, let me pick it up. It was the year 1947. It was a difficult year. During that time, I spent almost 9 months under the care of one RAF hospital or another. Eventually, it was decided that I should undergo spinal surgery in the hope of curing a problem which had troubled me over a long period and was causing great pain. Because of the nature of the operation, well, there's a nice medical word for you coming up, a laminectomy, I was forced to lie on my stomach for several days before the wound began to heal. And during that time, he received a visit from a spiritualist, Albert Taylor. And Albert must have recommended he visit Harry Edwards. When I had recovered sufficiently to travel, I was instructed to return to my station in Manby in Lincolnshire. A few weeks later, the back trouble for which I had been treated began to manifest again, and I had no choice but to return to the medical officers. After consultations with two of them, I was sent down to a convalescent home at Newton Ferrers in Devon. Having been given a warrant to travel, I decided to risk a quick stop off in London. Harry Edwards, whose healing sanctuary was based at Burrows-Lee in Surrey, a few miles outside London, was by this time a well-known and respected healer, and, having had enough of the back problems which were causing me so much trouble, I'd made up my mind to telephone him for an appointment. Harry himself answered the phone when I called, and I asked if he could see me the next morning. He told me he was sorry, but they did not do healing on that particular day. My heart sank at this, and I told him that unfortunately it meant I wouldn't be able to come at all. When he asked why not, I said that I was in the RAF and was travelling from A to B. Immediately he said, "Lad, I'll see you." So I went down to his sanctuary and had healing from him. It was just Harry and me. There was no one else in sight. So successful was the healing that when I got to the convalescent home a couple of days later and had a medical examination, the medics accused me of swinging the lead. I was sent straight back to duty, and when I finally left the RAF in 1948, I was classed as A1. What they didn't know was that I had been to see Harry Edwards, and that whatever was wrong with me, he had put right. Though I would come to know him very well in later life, that was my first great tribute to Harry and his excellent healing. And Harry talks about his time in the RAF earlier in the book, where he said that in one camp, they said to him, "What's all this about you wanting to be a vegetarian?" He said, "I am a vegetarian." And he thinks he found out that he was probably the first vegetarian in the RAF, maybe official. One commanding officer who was talking with him about his dietary requirements also asked him, "Have you got any other weird and wonderful traits?" And Eric says, "Well, I'm a spiritualist." Get out of here. Go on, get out. Shut the door behind you. People knew about spiritualism in those days, but maybe it wasn't that popular. Uh, One person who made spiritualism very, very popular indeed was Gordon Higginson. And in the book, Eric is describing how in the early 1950s, I drove Gordon Higginson to South Wales, where he was to demonstrate at a number of public meetings. We stayed with Tom and Mabel Hibbs, whose house had by this time become almost a second home to me. Alec and Daisy Leary were also there, since Alec would be the speaker at Gordon's meetings. At the conclusion of the first meeting held in Tonopandi, we all returned to the Hibbs home where Mabel's sister Abby had prepared freshly cooked ham accompanied by chips, the like of which I had rarely tasted. Cracking Welsh chips. We ate at a huge rectangular table, 7 feet long and made of solid oak. There were 9 of us for the meal, including Gordon, Hibbs, Tom, and Mabel's son. After the excellent supper, we were chatting away when our conversation turned to the phenomena of table moving, table tilting. More in jest than with serious thought, we wondered whether anything could be achieved with a very heavy table at which we were sitting. We cleared it completely and placed a séance trumpet in the middle of it. All the lights were extinguished, but a fire burned merrily in the hearth, cast a glow throughout the room. We sang cheerful songs and Welsh hymns, never really thinking anything would happen, just being happy. Each of us placed both hands on the table and were amazed when, after a short while, we heard a tapping sound from inside the trumpet, which then started slowly to move around. Before long, the motion became more rapid as the trumpet moved from person to person. No doubt that's independent of any human hand on it. Well, human in the physical, that is. Someone suggested we should listen in case the trumpet had anything to tell us. Our hands were still on the table, clearly visible in the firelight, and to our great surprise, we heard sounds coming from under the table, followed by sounds on its surface. We then felt a gentle movement of the table, which, after a moment or two, became more pronounced, as did the psychic energy we were all feeling. Without further warning, the table began to rise, our hands still upon it. We were stunned and decided to take them off to see what would happen. The table continued to rise until it was several inches off the ground, after which it suddenly descended to the floor and everything was still, no doubt with a great big bang. We were very excited, especially since none of us had been in trance and we had all witnessed what had taken place. By this time it was about 2:30 in the morning, and we all went to bed, some of us far too excited to sleep. The next morning, Alec Leary, a scientist, went downstairs ahead of everyone, measured the table, and estimated that it weighed 200 pounds, 90.5 kilos. The next evening's public meeting took place in Cardiff, chaired by Mr. Trenchard, a senior official at the docks. Afterwards, he offered us refreshments, but we politely declined them since we were desperate to experiment again with the table. We planned to replicate the exact physical conditions that had existed prior to the previous night's dramatic events. Fire burned in the grate, Abby cooked us the same meal, and we all sat in the same places and sang the same songs. What happened? Precisely nothing. As time went on, my conviction that life was eternal remained strong. And the book also contains Eric's wife Heather's recollections, especially prior to the time when she lived on the Isle of Wight, before she'd even met Eric. So this was Heather as a child on the Isle of Wight. So it was that Heather grew up immersed in a world where the spiritualist ethos was an accepted and fundamental part of her life. For her, belief in the world of spirit was as natural as breathing. Indeed, she was endowed with a mediumistic gift herself. Heather encountered many fine mediums during her childhood, and perhaps the most remarkable of her experiences came with the visit of the famous materialization medium Helen Duncan. Mrs. Duncan was staying as a guest in the Jermy home. Jermy is spelled Jermy. Her father was named Willie Jermy. and he'd been a driving force in the establishment of spiritualism on the Isle of Wight in Victoria Street. Church was dedicated by Ernest Houghton, who was the editor of Two Worlds at that time, and under her father's leadership, the church grew and thrived. They had visitors such as Anna Swaffer, Ellen Hughes, Nan Mackenzie, Harry Edwards, Bertha Harris, and Ernest Houghton, and they all stayed in the family home with Willie and his wife Lily. So Heather encountered many fine mediums during her childhood, and perhaps the most remarkable of her experiences came with the visit of the famous materialization medium Helen Duncan. Mrs. Duncan was staying as a guest in the home and had agreed to give a materialization séance for a number of invited sitters. Although Heather was entirely at ease with mediumship, she was only about 9 years old at the time of Mrs. Duncan's visit, and thus was told that she could not attend the séance and must go to bed. Being inquisitive, she didn't like this one bit, and decided to creep quietly down the stairs with the intention of listening in at the door of the séance room. In later years, I would pull her leg about this and say that she was just nosy. I imagine she must have been a little bit anxious when, as she leant lightly against the closed door, it opened fractionally. Everybody inside the room was taken aback as all of a sudden a deep, mellifluous voice boomed out. "Let the child in." It was the voice of Mrs. Duncan's guide, Albert Stewart. The door was duly opened. Heather went in and was allowed to remain for the rest of the séance. It was an experience she would never forget. Even if she was reprimanded by her parents afterwards, she sat with Mrs. Duncan on one further occasion, but it was by invitation. She didn't have to creep downstairs at all that time. Now, Eric Hatton was also, as I mentioned, when he sang at the Greater World Convention, he entered the National Eisteddfod of Wales in 1960. Now, Eric sang at a great many spiritualist conventions, and he attended countless conventions all over the world and met spiritualists from all over the world who travelled to wherever the convention was. Now, at one such convention, the medium was Walter Brooks. One of the ladies, named Marie-Louise, was so impressed by Walter's evidential demonstration, he was able to relay some details to her in Swedish, that she invited him to visit Sweden and stay in her family home. Her husband was a High Court judge, and when Walter eventually arrived in Sweden, the couple took him to a castle they owned in the north. I've always been intrigued by something Walter told me about the trip. Walter was, if I may use the term, a cold bird. For he had a real problem with chilly weather and usually wore at least one, and sometimes two, pullovers when he came to stay with us. However, the cold air of northern Sweden had been a different matter altogether, and had provided him with a new and fascinating insight into his own mediumship. In that crisp, rarefied air, the clarity of his clairaudience was apparently almost 100% sharper than normal. Well, that's interesting, isn't it? In another demonstration to Congress delegates, a further interesting aspect of Walter's mediumship was revealed when he directed a message to a Spanish lady and her daughter who, respectively, had lost their husband and father. Walter had no knowledge of any language other than English, so the information was relayed through an interpreter. Suddenly, and completely without warning, Walter broke into Spanish, astounding everyone present. none more so than the two Spanish ladies themselves. The husband in spirit was telling the two ladies through Walter that he knew they had to lie in order to attend Congress, saying that they were coming to England for a conference on herbal medicine. The reason for this deception was that the Spanish dictator General Franco held the country in an iron grip, and spiritualism had been outlawed by his regime. Now, Walter's mediumship was so good that he gave Heather and Eric the date of the birth of their second child as the 6th of December, 4 years before the event, and said the second child would be a boy. And so there's a lovely description of the birth of said boy in the book, and with Eric nervously pacing back and forth. And after the birth of the baby, his anxiety and excitement of the preceding hours began to fade. And so my brain started to work, pondering the question of how such specific predictions can from time to time be fulfilled. The business of times and dates from the spirit world's perspective has always intrigued me. It seems that we get an overlapping of time in the clairvoyance facility which, in some people's opinions, is all happening at that one moment. One moment and a folding of the clairvoyance facilities. Whilst this may to some extent be true, it suggests to me, as it has to researchers far more learned than I, that it all belongs to the now. By that I mean that events of the past, of today, and of the future are all part of an extension of time as we know it. In his book An Experiment with Time, published in 1927, the scientist John William Dunn postulates this theory and makes a very convincing case for it. Walter Brooks would have had to interpret the information he received clairvoyantly or clairaudiently as would any other medium, whilst we, and no doubt the mediums themselves, might wish the process of communication to be akin to a telephone call. It is not so, and the mechanics of it are far from straightforward. Whatever the case, Walter was as fine a medium, and I have always thought it a pity that he was not more widely recognised. And Herrick mentions several other mediums, similarly unrecognised, but nevertheless exceptionally talented. Talking about spirits on the telephone, what Herrick is saying there, that mediums would like to be exactly as a telephone. But I was talking the other day with Lawrence Main, who is a modern day druid, and he categorically stated, when I asked him about the interaction between druidism and modern spiritualism, in that we all spoke with speak, and druids spoke in the past with spirits. I asked him what experiences he's had speaking with spirits, and he categorically stated, well, one day I answered the phone and I had a long conversation with a man, and after I put the phone down, I realised he died a couple of weeks before. It was his friend of his who was dead, spoken in the now via the telephone. Now, here's a very interesting story. In 1971, I had the honour of meeting Lillian Bailey, one of the most renowned mediums of her day. Heather and I were introduced to her at a Psychic News dinner dance held in London. We were very much aware of her reputation as a remarkable medium, so even a brief moment in her company was a privilege. And Herrick is indebted to Psychic News and his friend Roy Stemman for allowing him to use the following information, which Roy included in his excellent book, Spirit Communication. Lillian was in great demand by people from all walks of life, but the incident to which I shall now refer was a closely guarded secret until after her passing, and she never betrayed her oath of secrecy. Out of the blue, she received a request from a stranger to give a séance at a house in Kensington, London, to which she agreed. A limousine arrived to take her to a well-appointed property, from where she was taken to another address. Most unusually, she was required to put on a blindfold for the duration of the journey, so that there would be no visual clues about the person or people she would be meeting. Again, she agreed. Arriving at the second destination, she was eventually led into a room where she sensed others were gathered, and she was asked to conduct the séance while still blindfolded. This was not a great hindrance to her, since she often worked in a trance. Puzzled but nonetheless philosophical about the lengths to which people would go to test her mediumship, she drifted off into trance, allowing her main helper, Bill Wotton, and others in the next world to speak through her lips. After what seemed to her no time at all, she returned to normal consciousness and was told that she could now remove the blindfold. As her eyes grew accustomed to the light, she surveyed the sitters, sitting in a circle on gilt chairs, with a Queen Mother, the Queen, Prince Philip, Princess Margaret, Princess Alexandra, and the Duke of Kent. This astonishing experience, which took place a year after the death of King George VI, had clearly been arranged in the hope of receiving a communication from the dead monarch. Given the calibre of Lillian Bailey's mediumship, it was almost certainly successful. However, since she had been in a trance, the medium knew nothing of her conversation which had taken place between members of the British royal family and those from the spirit world who wished to speak to them. Unsurprisingly, none of those who participated has ever commented directly on the secret séance. Royal biographer and Daily Telegraph court correspondent Anne Morrow included this unique event in her book, The Queen Mother. She asked Gordon Adams, at that time an employee of Psychic News, if his mother-in-law Lillian Bailey had been unnerved when she removed the blindfold. He replied that his mother-in-law had had dealings with all sorts of people, such as the Chinese leader Chiang Kai-shek and the King of Greece, so did not feel intimidated by royalty. It was almost like a day's work to her. Her mediumship was so natural. Queen Mother is reported to have continued to phone Lillian for some time after that séance, and further private sittings are said to have taken place. Eventually, when she came to terms with her loss and was clearly satisfied that the dead king continued to watch over her from the world of spirit, the Queen Mother asked the medium to come to Clarence House one last time. Removing a piece of jewellery from the dress she was wearing, she pinned it on Lillian Bailey's shoulders, saying, "We don't own many personal possessions, but I would like you to accept this." No doubt, the gift expressed her gratitude for the comfort she had received. And almost immediately the Queen Mother returned to public life. But since the royal family has never confirmed the story, can we be sure that this remarkable event actually took place? She was already famous. And since the story was never published during her lifetime, it did not in any way affect her standing amongst spiritualists or the public. More to the point, in an observation by Anne Morrow in writing her book, she received assistance from both the Queen Mother and her private secretary, Sir Martin Gilliatt. They saw proofs of the book prior to its publication and raised no objection to inclusion of the report on the royal séance. The The story was repeated again without objection in Anne Morrow's Without Equal, Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, published in July 2000 to mark her centenary. So here's another reading from the book. I have already mentioned that in my teenage years I attended an Anglican church 2 or 3 times each Sunday. Listening to and reading with the teachers there, I was intrigued by biblical references to the physical return of various dead persons, such as Moses and Elijah, and of course to Jesus' own appearance to his followers following his crucifixion and subsequent internment. When later I became convinced by the weight of evidence in support of spiritualism's message of survival, I began to see these biblical events through rather different eyes, and was, to say the least, curious as to whether any comparable manifestations were taking place in our own time within the UK or elsewhere. Eventually, Heather's and my mutual interest in spiritualism led us, along with 100 or so others, to attend a summer school in South Wales, organised by Tom and Mabel Hibbs, stalwarts of spiritualism in that area. As a result of our attendance, we were offered the opportunity to join a few other fortunate people at a physical mediumship séance in Cardiff. It was to take place at the home of a couple named Alec and Louis Harris. I think it was 31 Manor Way. The house is still there today. It used to be in a cul-de-sac. It's now on the side of a dual carriageway leading the main route from north of Cardiff into Cardiff city centre. We had heard that Alec was that rarest of creatures, a materialization medium, and we relished the chance to be present at one of his sittings. Where true physical mediumship is concerned, the resulting phenomena can sometimes be so remarkable as to be almost beyond belief. It is therefore vitally important that steps are taken to ensure there can be no possibility of fraudulent activity occurring. Scrupulous checks must be carried out in advance of the séance to ensure the complete integrity of any phenomena which might manifest. So it was that the ordinary domestic room in which the séance was to be held was subjected to thorough searching and meticulous examination. Windows, floorboards, the room's fittings, and single door all came under the scrutiny of Lawrence Wilson, a barrister, and his brother Geoffrey, a physicist, under the watchful eye of their father Percy, none of whom had previously met the medium or his wife. Percy Wilson was a man of great integrity, respected in many fields. In addition to holding a senior position as Principal Assistant Secretary at the Ministry of Transport, he was also editor of the Gramophone magazine and the recipient of international awards for his contributions to the field of sound reproduction. Indeed, he counted the great television and electronics pioneer John Logie Baird as a personal friend. John Logie Baird, spiritualist, investigated spiritualism, and he invented a talking tube that became eventually the cathode ray tube to make television work. Together with 2 other sitters, these men examined Alec Harris to assure themselves that there were no items concealed about his person. Their searches satisfactorily completed, we took our seats and, amid an atmosphere of excited anticipation, the séance began. On instruction from Mrs. Harris, we started to sing in order to raise the vibrations within the room, sometimes deemed a helpful prelude to the production of physical phenomena. Within a short time, raps were heard in various parts of the room, often coming from more than one direction at a time. These percussive sounds were followed by the movement of illuminated seance trumpets, metal or cardboard cone-shaped objects, usually 1 to 2 feet in length, which danced about the room at varying speeds, sometimes slow and graceful, at other times swift and agile. At one point they passed near us, even touching us lightly before moving upwards to the ceiling. A short pause followed this remarkable burst of activity, after which a circle guide from the etheric world materialized in physical form and proceeded to welcome us all. Following this, spirit helpers of differing physical types manifested one after another. Perhaps the most remarkable of these materializations was that of a female child, who stepped from the cabinet and walked freely amongst us. She was, of course, a complete contrast to Alec Harris in every possible respect, he being a little under 6 feet tall and in early middle age, and she a small girl. I should state here that no physical child, female or male, was present in the seance room. After this spirit child had left us, there followed what was without doubt the most moving and extraordinary part of the seance. One by one, spirit friends materialized and greeted their loved ones who were present in the seance room. It was the greatest of privileges to bear silent witness to the joyful embrace of loved ones reunited, each sitter clearly recognizing their own materialized relative or friend, and having not the slightest doubt as to their identity. The impact of this upon Heather and myself was tremendous, to the point of bewilderment. Such profoundly touching reunions were almost beyond belief, yet they happened, provided healing balm to the souls of those who had loved and lost and found again. Later on, as the seance drew to a close, and in a level of red light which enabled us all to see clearly, an Arab guide materialized in front of us, dressed in traditional Middle Eastern garments. He was joined by a North American Indian, complete with full feathered headdress. Last to appear was the little girl, in a final act of great evidential value. All three remained with us, while the curtain of the cabinet opened to reveal the medium Alec Harris in his chair. I'll say that again. All three remained with us while the curtain of the cabinet opened. He doesn't say that the curtain was opened by Louis or other circle members. Maybe the curtains were also physically moved. We watched enthralled and amazed as the North American Indian dissolved towards the floor and disappeared before our very eyes. The Arab guide followed suit, after which the little girl walked behind the cabinet curtain, and the séance came to an end. For me, these remarkable revelations not only equaled, but surpassed those long ago recorded events of biblical times. Yeah, but you've got to witness them, haven't you? And the witnesses to Jesus's physical mediumship, they were also amazed and enthralled. Another little story that's very interesting is about the mediumship of Sally Ferguson. And she'd been taken ill and was in hospital. And her husband had passed some years prior to this event. We visited Sally daily, and on a number of occasions were jolted by the shrill ringing of alarm bells attached to the various pieces of equipment around her bed, thinking that they must signify Sally's imminent passing. Such was her determination, though, that she always managed to overcome these crises. When we visited Sally the evening before Lisa's birthday, we were amazed to find her very cheerful. The next day, Heather and I were called urgently to the hospital and, on arrival, found a very different Sally from the one we had seen less than 24 hours earlier. Visibly weaker, she held our hands and whispered reassuringly, "Don't worry, I'm all right. They are here to collect me." With that, she closed her eyes and was gone. Crossed over. A nursing sister ushered us gently away and drew the curtains around the bed. Both she and another nurse burst into tears. As the sister composed herself, she told us that on the day before, the nurses had been carrying out various procedures for Sally when a man appeared in the ward. He was unknown to the nursing staff, and the sister told him in no uncertain terms that he should leave. Hearing this, Sally said calmly, "Don't worry, it's only Bert. He's counting the buttons, but I've told him he's got to wait a bit longer. I'm not ready yet." When the sister and nurse looked up, the man was gone. Heather and I were intrigued by this account and asked the sister what the man had looked like. As she described him, we knew for certain that it had been Bert Ferguson, for Sally had given us a photograph of him some years before. They had been a devoted couple, and in his eagerness to take his wife to her new home, he had arrived just a little early. There's a great chapter on Harry Edwards and his wonderful healing mediumship. Harry used no ostentatious prayers, nor was there any requirement to believe in any form of religion, including spiritualism. No pious attitude was demanded or expected. There was simply an indefinable something in the atmosphere which enabled some remarkable cures to be achieved with a touch of his healing energy. Well, I hope you enjoyed a few extracts I read from the book, and the book is filled with much, much more by way of testimony from the wonderful Eric Hatton. And here we have Eric Hatton speaking on the BBC.
With you, Eric, and ask you what you mean by spiritualism in simple layman's terms.
Well, I believe that spiritualism is based on the cardinal fact of spirit communion and influx. It is the effort to discover truth relating to man's spiritual nature, his capacities, relations, duties, welfare and destiny, and its application to a regenerate life. It recognizes a continuous divine inspiration in man, and it aims through a careful, reverent study of facts at a knowledge of the laws and principles which govern the occult forces of the universe, of the relations of spirit to matter, and of man to God and the spiritual world. It is thus universal and progressive, leading to true religion as at one with the highest possible known philosophy.
Well, I think it's a very articulate and very carefully thought out statement of your beliefs.
Yes.
But what would you say was the key essence of spiritualism? Lots of people who are not spiritualists think of darkly lit rooms and seances and tables coming off the ground. Is that just the sort of more controversial part, or is that perhaps the basic principle of your belief?
I think this to be the basic principle of my belief, but of course spiritualism has been coined and misinterpreted in many ways, and undoubtedly the average outsider would conceive what they have either heard from various folk, hearsay, to be the general conception of spiritualism that we meet in darkened rooms, which is certainly not the case. Only on very rare occasions, and I would delegate this to the science laboratory, where people meet for the purpose of investigating in this manner.
What would you say the appeal of spiritualism was? Because despite the fall-off in attendance at some other forms of religion, perhaps more orthodox forms of religion, your churches seem to be full to capacity often. It seems to have a tremendous appeal with people.
Well, I think that people are looking for an answer to problems that they're not readily able to accept from varying forms of religious doctrine of the past. And this is no disrespect to religion. But I think people, by virtue of their training these days, want an answer that they can equate with their scientific and more academic line of reasoning. And this is why we seem to be attracting a lot of people of a reasonably high standard of intelligence, certainly many young people who are coming to us from universities and colleges and from high schools. And it may well be that they find that they want an answer which is not readily available elsewhere.
I think we should get one thing clear at the beginning, Eric, and that is it possible to be a spiritualist and a Christian, or are the two mutually exclusive?
Oh, no, indeed not. I think it's possible to be a spiritualist and a Christian, equally as it's possible to be a Buddhist and a Christian, or any other religion in the world. Spiritualism has no creed or dogma, and it is universal in its appreciation of all forms of religious life and philosophy. And in that particular sense, it is not anti in any one particular way. In that those who have dedicated themselves to this particular way of life by virtue of their research and their revealing of a new facet of life are indeed exceedingly sincere people, and to regard us as being in darkness by virtue of this perhaps is a little unfair. In so far as consulting the dead on behalf of the living, most of the writings that I've ever read of that are reasonably authentic seem to suggest, as does my own experience in recent years, that it's people who choose to get into contact with us rather than we to consult them. For instance, if there is a live spiritual force in the world, and I believe there to be, we can call it, it's called by God, by many people, then he must, God, whatever we conceive God to be, must have ambassadors who come from a spiritual realm to proclaim light into the world. And that God has left us, or should have left us, without new revelations in the past 2,000 years since the days of Jesus, strikes me as somewhat remiss. I have always regarded God as being a living God, and I therefore accept that a living God would constantly wish to reveal his livelihood, as it were, his living capacity to the people who are still living, the children of his eternal kingdom. The hope of Jesus Christ, well, most certainly those who are of the Christian faith would find this to be the cardinal point, and I accept this. But Buddhist friends of mine and Hindu friends of mine would, of course, differ upon that point. And since from a purely numerical point of view, Christianity in the world is greatly inferior, then I would find it rather remiss that a God of love would have no hope for those who, because of their geographical position, would never have a chance to hear of Jesus Christ. Now, having said that, I have great love and admiration for Jesus Christ, so I say it with some feeling. But I equally say it for the feeling of those who belong to other religions who may never have heard of Jesus or the message that he brought. But there are a lot of people who subscribe to the spiritualist belief who never consulted either mediums or have never consulted with spiritual beings who want to contact us, simply because of their investigations, their reading. As we read of our religious belief because of the Bible, they have found that their reasoning leads them to accept a philosophy which spiritualism leads them along toward.
I would like to play an extract from an interview I did with Eva Upton, who is a medium in the Midlands. Here in this extract, she's describing her experiences at a spiritualist weekend and how, in her opinion, a spirit came out of a cupboard.
The spirit friend came right out, turned right round and said, "Can you see me? Don't you think I look nice?" And just like that, just like any ordinary person, you see. And they had a wonderful conversation together, the two.
What did the spirit look like?
Well, it was a lady. Just ordinary.
What was she wearing?
Well, it was like a white robe or gown or whatever you like to call it, you see. But definitely, I asked the lady afterwards and she said, oh, definitely. I can't tell you now who she said it was. But she said, oh, it was fantastic. And the names of the streets of Coventry and all the different places and names of people that were given, and they were all accepted, you see.
And this spirit was meant to be a relation of hers, was it?
Yes, you see. But a lot of the names that were given were people who had worked in the movement around the West Midlands. And it was really a fantastic. I'm only hoping and waiting for another one.
How do you know, though, Eva, it was genuine? How do you know it wasn't somebody with a sheet on?
Because I was too near the cabinet for him to do that.
While this was taking place, the medium was in the cabinet with the curtains drawn. So how did you know that he was not speaking and pretending that it was the voice of the spirit? In fact, it was...
Couldn't, because they whipped the curtains back after a while and he was just there in the chair, like asleep.
Lots of people would find that absolutely beyond belief. They would say that it couldn't possibly exist and that people who practice this are fakers, they're con men.
No. You might get one or two that might try to do it. This takes a long while developing, and there's got to be a certain amount of build-up, shall we put it like that, build-up of the power in the room to enable this to be done.
Now, how does the spirit appear? Is it one moment not there and then there, or do you see it gradually emerging?
Well, you saw it emerging through the curtain. Through the curtain, you see.
It came in ectoplasm from the medium?
Through the curtain, yes. And then you see it withdraw back again.
If you say that there might be a few fakers and con men in spiritualism, why is there a need for any fakers? Because if it's genuine, there wouldn't be need for any fake at all. And the fact that you admit that there are some people might think that means that everybody's a con man.
Don't you think that in everything people try to fake or con if they're going to make some money from it?
How much have you made out of your 40 years as a medium?
Nothing.
Nothing at all?
No.
Why do you do it then if it's not for money?
Shall I tell them? I thank you to God.
That was Eva Upton, a medium in the Midlands. I don't think anybody would doubt Eva's sincerity, but Eric, what would you say to people who would regard that interview as almost a description of a magician on a stage doing a cabaret turn almost?
Well, anyone who was unfamiliar with the scene, they would be justified in making a certain observation of that order. But at the same time, it's very unwise to make observations if one has not investigated the procedure. Some years ago, when I was most sincere in my investigation, very much in doubt as to whether this kind of phenomena could be seen or experienced, I went to such an experiment together with a medium in Cardiff. And amongst the people who were present were two now very well-known scientists. In those days, they were naturally younger. They weren't as well-known as they are today, together with a doctor and other people. But each of these three gentlemen were quite capable of assessing and evaluating the evidence that was seen and felt, pronounced upon it in the affirmative afterwards. Who had trained as a doctor, was able to examine quite minutely the individuals who materialized, and this is what it was. Now, the question, of course, that might be raised is, well, how do we know that this isn't the medium? How do we know that it isn't someone with a cloak over their head? All right. In the first instance, the one person who did, in fact, materialize was a small child. The medium was a person over 6 feet and a very big, broad man. But more than that, on another occasion, there were two individuals who were walking around the room independent, and the medium was sitting in the cabinet. Now, I should suggest, I must make this quite clear, that the room was examined minutely by various people, including these two scientists, and the light was sufficiently pronounced to be enabled to check everything that went on. This is a very rare form of phenomena these days, and it is not one that I think should be open to the general public. I would much prefer this to be, if needs be, to delegate it to the scientific laboratory or to a place where it can be studied by people who are competent.
You mentioned scientists there. A couple of months ago, in fact last year, two scientists had their views and story quoted in a Sunday newspaper, which slammed spiritualism in quite a hard way. They said, for example, that there were secret compartments in chairs at the seances, and it was actually material, and the room where the seance was held, it was actually locked, and no one was allowed in before the thing started, which does make the average reader of the paper a little bit suspicious of spiritualism.
But of course, and I accept this, but may I say that they did not slam spiritualism, they slammed one spiritualist.
Well, he slammed perhaps the best-known medium in the country.
Well, that being as it may, I understand that in more recent times one of those people has withdrawn his statement and the other has failed to go further with it. Now, having said that, anyone is at liberty to make a statement. Whether they prove the statement is open to question at a later date in a court or in some form of hearing. So, to God is through Jesus Christ. But I must return to this point earlier on, that simply because some of us feel that we're not as wholeheartedly, perhaps, in love with Jesus, that doesn't mean to say that I am not in love with Jesus, but that people, because of their geographical position, because of their attitude over a reasoning aspect, cannot be saved or cannot be part of God's eternal kingdom simply because they cannot accept Jesus, seems to suggest that God is not a loving Father. The cardinal principles that we have is the fatherhood of God, the all-embracing fatherhood of God that extends love to anyone, whether they are Christian, whether they are of any other religion, or whether they have no religion at all. But the humility that God extends, the unfolding all-universal power is so great that no one can be beyond redemption, no matter who or what they are. There is the Church's fellowship now for psychical and spiritual studies, to which a very great number of clergymen and bishops subscribe. And I think it would be wrong to say that all those are absolutely wrong. They must have some basis for furthering their own investigation. And in conclusion, may I say this. When it comes to the field of exploration of the psychic and spiritual realm, then I believe that intelligent people are obviously wanting to find their own answer to life. And if in the process, as I believe the purpose of spiritualism to be, to reveal the hidden destiny of mankind's spiritual nature, then I can only suggest that that is a good thing.